his book Ways of Seeing, which is all about representations of women throughout art history, the history of painting, not really photography, but it carries over those arguments. And Laura Mulvey's, her seminal essay, Visual Pleasure and Narratives. So all of those kinds of, in the video, I start to ruminate on all of those arguments and how I actually stopped photographing people at a certain point because I felt that it was just, it was too much. It was just being, so critiqued, and you had all the kind of pictures generation who had photographs of people, but they were like, Richard Prince taking photographs of the Marlboro Man in advertising, or Cindy Sherman taking pictures of herself, but always kind of, in the disguise of prototypical femininity.
But it's interesting how in that film you're able to revisit your own work through a similar device of reappropriating it for the video. So it's kind of mediated at sort of one or two removes. And so your own work kind of becomes subject to some of those same devices, I guess. But I also think it's interesting that, you can talk about that work in terms of this very personal narrative and biographical narrative, but also, as you've been just doing, you can talk about it very much as a kind of, it kind of lays bare the kind of condition and the process of its own production in a way. And, we described it as a kind of essay film. And I think there is something about that kind of essayistic movement within it where, kind of one thing leads on to the next thing and the next thing, and it just kind of circles these various different... But I wondered also whether we could talk just a little bit about one of the most remarkable things when you've talked about all of those other aspects of the film, which is the kind of the device that you use through the auto prompt. So I know that you write, the scripts are kind of written first, and then you record them onto a kind of tape or a dictaphone, which are then played back through this earpiece, so that you're able, when you set those shots up in your apartment in New York, in your home, to recount the script without reading it physically from a paper. And it's a very, very particular device. And at first there's almost this kind of awkwardness or this kind of quite difficult delivery, which again sort of sets up a mediation, I think, or another kind of distance between the subject and how it's being delivered. But I wonder, was that the first film in which you used that device?
Yes, Le Godesse was the first time that I used it.
And how did you come to that? Was it practical, or were you...
It was practical. The first film that I made in that style was called 50 Minutes, and that one I memorized or attempted to memorize the whole script and then perform it for the camera. And it actually took me, I think, 3 years to make that film, whereas Le Godesse took 1 year. I didn't have to memorize anything. I just wrote it, recorded it, and I got the idea from seeing a performance that a friend of mine, the artist Suzanne Bocanegra, did in New York, where she had written a text. Actually, it was an artist talk, but she had a male actor performing it, and he was using the audio prompt. So he was listening to her voice and then repeating it. And that talk about layers of distance. She has a male actor playing her, speaking, her text in the first person. And I asked her afterwards, can I use this? Am I stealing from you if I use this audio prompt? And she said, absolutely not. It's actually something that the Worcester Group, I don't know if you guys are familiar with, it's this very fantastic theater performance group in New York, and they use a lot of video and a lot of pre-recorded elements, and they use this audio prompt a lot. And she said, I just got it from the Worcester Group. And so it was, for me, it was just a fantastic way to kind of continue, but in the same vein, but without all of the problems of memorization.
It's interesting that it comes from that very pragmatic kind of point, though, because, you know, for me, there are these moments where you can hear the kind of tiny, tinny voice going into your ear, and then
because I have a mic here, and I'm listening through an earpiece, and sometimes it's the record. It's just kind of loud, and the mic is picking up first what's coming through the earpiece, and then I speak it. So there's this funny kind of...
And this kind of slight delay and this doubling.
Yeah.
But also, and we said this the other evening when we were walking through the galleries on the members' tour, actually, I think that film and also Hemlock Forest and so much of your work, for me, always seems to speak to this kind of split between your kind of life in the kind of social world, your life in the world, and the kind of life of the mind or the intellect in a way. And you talk about that a lot in the films, and reading is a really great, I mean, the Subway Writers, for me, is another really great way of imaging that very kind of public space of the subway, with all of these people, very, very visible. But when you have these people writing in those, or reading as well, there's a very private and very intimate activity taking place, which is entirely it's hidden, and it's kind of locked away from the world. But what to me is produced really strongly in that device is this sense of this kind of inside and outside, this interior and exterior. And again, it seems to be kind of amplified through the way that, you know, again, I guess it could be very pragmatic, but that you shoot these scenes in the spaces of your home, in your apartment, in these very domestic spaces, which again, you could think of the kind of the domestic, the feminized space, the space of the home, the house, the family. And again, there's this kind of, you're either in those spaces or looking out into New York City, out into the view. And there seems to be a lot of play between this kind of interior, exterior, inside, outside.
Yeah. And the only times I really go outside to photograph or film is on the subway, which
is another kind of inside in a way.
Yeah, it is. It's a funny kind of inside-outside as well. But it's a favorite location, the subway. I mean, it's just, it gives me, it scares me to do it because it's so public, and I'm always afraid I'm going to get confronted. But it also gives me an incredible thrill to do it, and you know, because it taps into a whole genre of street photography that I really love. That is hardly practiced anymore, but it's a kind of work that I love to look at, and so on some level I'm reproducing that a little bit in the subway.
And it's interesting, in the exhibition, the first room you come into has the Subway Writers, and in a way it really is a kind of that location, but also those images are a kind of connective space between the two films. So Les Godesses ends with a kind of coda where you begin to talk about making those subway photographs and the Subway Writers, and some of them are featured in that film. And then the subway became a really interesting or really important point of departure in the new film, Hemlock Forest. So maybe this is a good moment to maybe talk a little bit about Hemlock Forest, and again to say that Les Godesses was completed in 2011. Hemlock Forest you completed this year, so 5 years later. And again, I mean, you talk about this in the film, and we talk about it in the text a little bit, that again, it felt like it started from us approaching you, commissioning a new work. And again, this kind of, not crisis, but this moment of, okay, so where do I begin? What's the, how do I start? Where do I make? And maybe you could say something about Hemlock Forest.
Sure. You know, I'll just, before I say, talk about Hemlock, I'll just say, in Les Godesses, I quote Walter Benjamin, who said, "To do without photography, to do without people, is for photography the most impossible of renunciations. And that was kind of the, that was sort of like the other, touchstone thought. You had Martha Rossler, who argued that, you should never show, destitute, people in photographs. And then you have, he wasn't talking about, necessarily, but so it was just a thought that stuck with me, and I've written about it, and it kind of became, like, I guess, a bit of a dialectic in Les Godesses, these two, arguments, one for eliminating the figure and another one for the kind of pivotal role of the figure in the photograph.
And that's reintroduced through the subway writers in the coda, in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I hadn't really photographed people since 1994. I took, and I wasn't even really, I was photographing newsstands, and sometimes there would be a vendor in the newsstand, but I had kind of stopped, taking pictures of people, and then just kind of pushed myself out and made myself do this difficult thing of taking photographs on the subway, having no idea if it would, if I could manage it. But that also, that comes up in Hemlock Forest, because there's this whole kind of these ideas of risk, and the kinds of risks that you take as an artist, and for me it's this very kind of old-fashioned idea of kind of putting myself on the line somehow, and usually it means putting myself out in public and taking photographs, and
I know you like that. We've commissioned an essay on the new works, and in fact on the work in the exhibition by the Indian Calcutta-based writer Avik Sen.
Yeah, and he was the one who really kind of underlined that thought for me, and I thought it was so great and so important, because he talks about Hemlock Forest as always kind of vacillating between the fear of not risking enough, like getting shots that are just kind of easy, and risking too much, and kind of not knowing, being pulled in both. So he was the one in his essay who
risking what's too easy and risking what's too difficult.
And what's too difficult. Yeah. And I thought that was just, I hadn't thought about it in those terms at all. He was the one who really articulated that idea, but I think it's
maybe you could say something about Hemlock Forest then, in terms of, because again, it feels like with these works in particular, there's a starting point, which then isn't necessarily, that's just a point to kind of move off from.
Yeah.
And then it's almost like you're following these various different trails and these branches through until, you have this kind of essaying around these different subjects.
Right.
But the starting point for Hemlock Forest, I guess, was perhaps coming here to Bergen.
The starting point was reading Knausgaard and then rereading Mary Wollstonecraft, and from their writing getting this incredibly strong image of the forest. So that was a starting point. And then the other, then I wanted an image for the social. So I thought of the subway, because, I've, that's sort of become a theme, or a space that I revisit in my work. And I thought specifically of this shot that Chantal Akerman did in her film News from Home, in the subway, this incredible shot where the camera is perfectly still. It's on a tripod, and so I that space. I just really started with those two images, and I knew that I was going to either ask cinematographers to collect versions of that subway shot. Eventually, I decided to do it myself with a camera woman. My partner Jason gave me the great idea to clamp the camera to one of the poles in the subway, so it doesn't move at all. And that's really what's one of the things that's so interesting about that shot is because the subway just goes.
And you cut your shot with a short section of the brief, Ackerman film.
Yeah, where you see some seconds of her shot, which I described in the beginning. But okay, so I started with those 2 images, and I just started, I had notes, and I started to kind of put them together. But a lot of the beginning of Hemlock was about this idea that I didn't really have a subject compared to the film that I had just made before, which is called Notes on Blue, which was also a commission, but I was handed the subject. I was asked to make a work in response to the British filmmaker Derek Jarman. And so that's easy. You just watch all his films, you read his writing, but in this case, I had 2 images, and I really wasn't sure where to take it from there. But whenever I start a new piece of writing, I somehow naturally just begin with the thing that's preoccupying me the most in my life, or bothering me, or making me anxious, and
it starts with writing. Those films normally start with.
They all start with writing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, things that were going on in my life. One of them was that my son was about to go to college, and that was making me very sad, that the fact he's my only child and he was leaving. But I also had no idea how to write about that. That just seemed like the biggest cliche, and how could I write about that? And so I kind of circle around it, and eventually it kind of returns a bit more as a theme. But I start with that, and I just start with some notes that I had from watching a Godard film where someone says to live one's life or to tell it. And then I ask my son, do you keep a diary? And he says, no, I don't want to narrate my life. I want to live my life. And so much about the way I write is by making these, connections between really disparate writers and films, and I've already quoted Eileen Myles, but I'm going to quote her again because I think it's such a great quote. She said recently, I think it was in the New York Times, she said, if you can figure out the connections in writing, then everything kind of falls into place. And I think that's what I always do. That's the only way I can make it work, is by all of these. In Notes on Blue, I make this connection between Derek Jarman writing about Beowulf, and then Borges, writing a poem called Notes on the first page of Beowulf. So it's just people who have almost no relation. Yeah, and so, but it's really fun to do, and it allows, it allows me to tie together all these different ideas.
But at what point did you find that you were returning to some of those themes, in particular around your sisters? And because it felt like it was almost, it was certainly unexpected for me when I first watched the film with you.
Yeah.
There was no point at which you said, I think this is going to kind of almost function as a kind of sequel, or it's going to pick up from some of those themes in Les Godesses.
Okay, so
but there's a certain moment where, your sisters and some of those stories, and of course Wollstonecraft, who you've said has been somebody you've looked at over many years, really kind of becomes very present in that film.
Yeah. No, I reread her for that. Okay, so what happened was I was thinking about my son leaving. I was thinking about Les Godesses. I was thinking that it was, this very loving, kind of idealized portrait of my family. And then I was thinking about, things like, my sister lost a child to a drug overdose 3 years ago. And so I was thinking about, the difference between like my feelings about my son leaving and my sister actually having a child die, and I was thinking about all of these kind of things kind of unraveling in my family, and wondering if I should revisit Les Godesses and tell the story differently in light of these developments in my family. So it kind of started with that, like this idea that and I say it in the film, like what would it mean to revisit Les Godesses, and because you can tell, and any of you who've read Knausgaard know this, you can tell the same story differently over and over and over again, and it's kind of fascinating, I think, to do that. This Italian writer, Elena Ferrante, who's she's not exactly an autofiction writer, but to some degree she is. She does the same thing. It's sort of one story, and there's actually a lot of pleasure and satisfaction in the repetition of the same story and seeing how it gets told differently each time. It's like a different version of the truth each time. So that was this idea that I had so I thought, okay, I made Les Godesses, and I show my sisters 35 years ago when they're kids, and so what would it mean to actually film, all of us as we are now, and then I actually go and do it, and that scene gets included in Hemlock. So more and more the films, here I am talking about the films, but you can actually watch them, and I divulge a lot in the films themselves about how they came to be made, and the whole kind of thought process behind.
And you even refer to some of the reception or the writing around Les Godesses in Hemlock Forest.
Yes, I
mean,
do,
I'm thinking it's interesting that you mentioned Knausgaard again, because I was just going back through my emails and I couldn't find the quote, but I remember very early on after you visited, we were talking about Knausgaard, and I think I'd just finished reading the second one.
Yeah.
And there's this amazing passage in there where he starts to talk about the fact that there's this moment where he's unable to watch drama on TV anymore. He's totally rejecting, he's finding it impossible to read any novels, contemporary or historic. And the only thing that he feels he can respond and relate to and kind of consume at that time is kind of diaries and documentaries.
And letters.
And letters, exactly. And that becomes so strong in your work. And actually then there's this, you talk about Iman Issa, who's another artist who's based in New York City, who wrote this piece, I think, about Les Godesses.
She just wrote a blurb in art form, that's all it was.
But again, it talks about this idea of the I and this very kind of first person, diaristic, almost kind of confessional mode.
Yeah.
But I wondered whether you could, before we leave the films in a moment, but just maybe talk a little bit about that.
Well, the quote from Knausgaard is really wonderful, because it's something to the effect of he feels that when he's reading diaries and letters that he's kind of having a direct communication with another human being, that there's like no mediation, and it's just and he says something like, this is kind of the apex of art, having this very direct communion with another mind, and it's something that I've long I totally agree with him, and my favorite genres are diaries, especially diaries and letters, and it's you're not supposed to admit to liking memoirs now, but there are some amazing memoirs out there. I guess there's been a proliferation, and some of them are not so good, but there are some really great ones. So then this Iman Isa, she's an artist who lives in New York and Cairo, and she just wrote a little thing about Ligodess, about how she was really struck by my use of the I, of the first person, and how it wasn't a therapeutic I, it wasn't necessarily a confessional I. And then she says something like, perhaps Davey has come to realize that this is the only way to write the I. And so but she doesn't explain exactly what, how she comes to that conclusion. So I speculate on it, and I come up with this idea that it has to do with risk, that, if you're risking something, then you get a certain level of trust from the viewer or the reader.
But at the same time, even though she talks about it not being confessional, there does feel like in those works, but also in the way that you talk about them, that you're not sort of afraid or ashamed to think about the kind of cathartic.
I am ashamed.
Process. You are ashamed, but you acknowledge it, and you. But there is, and I think in some of those works, you're talking about a number of other authors and filmmakers who've talked about how. Now, who is it you're talking about?
Well, Borges talks a lot about the confession.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But also this sense that
and also,
you don't need a
course,
therapist if you're an artist. Was that Haneke?
Michael
Haneke, the filmmaker,
said, yeah.
So this idea that the artist can work it out through their work, which is kind of stated very explicitly. And but there's risk in that as well, because I think there is, there's also...
there's risk in the confessional, because it can just alienate the viewer, it can make them, like Borges argues that on some level, and it's very true, people crave the confessional. And he came to that realization from many lectures and talks that he gave, where people would come up to him afterwards and say, what we really like are the personal anecdotes that you tell, and we tell us more. And but you have to find a way to do it. And I think in all of my videos, I always leave in something that makes me cringe, that I find really hard to watch. And I do it partly just to point to the kind of diaristic element, to sort of, because some of these passages in Hemlock literally just come from my notebooks and my diaries, these kind of litanies of complaints about, pain and this and that, and the body aging and so on, and I wonder, is this a tick, that I'm leaving this stuff in, or do I, or is it? I'm still not sure, but I think what I just said about wanting to for people to really see, to kind of get an idea where the material, some of the material at least, is coming from. So, the narrations, they're a combination of writing from journals and notes that I've taken, and then research that I do into people like Wollstonecraft and Chantal Ackerman. I did a lot of research into her work, and she became a huge kind of driving force behind Hemlock Forest. Because what happened, and again, I tell the story, right off the bat in Hemlock in the first scene, I decided to go and shoot the subway scene, and then the next day I read that she had taken her own life, and so it was on the same day that I shot this scene, and at that point I just wanted to watch and rewatch her films, which I'd always loved, but I hadn't actually kept up with her so much. And then I got this incredible book, this notebook that she wrote, and actually a lot of the anecdotes that I tell in Hemlock about like the explosions of creativity, those come, I'm quoting the book, which I credit in the end. So yeah, that became, and it just became a huge pleasure also to go back and watch her films and to find these incredible conferences that she gave, and to kind of rediscover her, I think.
Maybe we should say something about the photographic works in the exhibition as well. We've got maybe 5 or 10 minutes left. But obviously there's photographs that you took. I think the earliest ones were around 1979, 1980. And many of those photographs have a very direct relationship to certainly Les Godesses, but also they feature in Hemlock Forest and provide, we've already talked about this a little bit, they're almost kind of reappropriated and kind of remediated through those new works. And I think that gives them another very particular kind of quality and operation when you then see them in the exhibition spaces. And this sense of a kind of authenticity or I don't know, they kind of play with these kind of different mediations and reproducibility. But the other work, which I think you began making in 2009, these kind of folded and mailed photographs, which actually operate very much like letters in a way, which is very interesting in terms of what you've been saying.
Or giant postcards. Chris Krauss said they were like giant postcards.
Well, exactly, this idea that, and so those works it's very obvious when you see them, but the photographs that you take are printed on photographic paper, they're folded, they're taped, and the tape leaves these kind of patterns on the image, and then they're addressed and they're mailed through the post. And there's some new works which relate more directly to Hemlock Forest, but also some works, particularly around Mary Wollstonecraft, and Mary Shelley, who was Wollstonecraft's daughter, the author of Frankenstein, which have a kind of pretty obvious relationship with Les Godesses and some of the themes in that. But I wondered whether you could say something about the relationship of those works to the films and whether you work on those things in parallel in a way, or whether you see them as quite distinct parts of your practice now. Because in the exhibition, curatorially, we very deliberately tried to bring these works together to...
and mix them up a little bit.
Exactly, to allow them to kind of mix through the spaces and to speak to each other. But I'm really curious as to how they operate and where they're located within your practice in a way.
So I made Les Godesses, and I was, I was invited to photograph in the Keats Shelley House in Rome. It's right by the Spanish Steps. This pretty great archive of, actually that was mostly kind of first edition books. And then I was in the New York Public Library, and I made a piece from those photographs in the Keats Shelley House. Then I was in the New York Public Library, and I saw that there was this little library within the huge library called the Pforzheimer Collection, Shelley and His Circle. And I knocked on the door, and I met the curator, and I eventually got permission to go and photograph in there. And that's where many of the photos downstairs are from the first edition of Wollstonecraft's books, letters written during a short residence in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. So, of course, the word letter appears over and over again in that book, and I just photographed it in close-up. So now I'm kind of always like writing something, turning it into a video, and making photographs in tandem. And for me, it's become a great way to work because it's very generative. One thing will give ideas for another, and I started, pulling in the old photographs of my sisters because I felt that they were really nice kind of companion to the works about Mary Wollstonecraft and her two daughters and their stepsister. Then with Hemlock Forest, I include some of my partner Jason's photographs. There evolved this whole theme around smoke, because my son had taken pictures of his best friend smoking, and I ended up using those in the video. And then I found these really old photographs of myself smoking, and I've always loved Jason's photographs of smoke. And so after I'd made the video, I started to think, well, I should really, wouldn't it be great to just like bring Jason's, Barney's, and my photographs together and kind of montage them with these, photographs that I took up here. What's it called?
On Floyen,
yeah.
on the mountain. Yeah.
And I think it was Hilda who said something really nice, because was I talking to you? And I was saying, it's a little bit weird to have your husband and your son's photographs in your show. Of course, it's on some level it's nepotistic. But you said something really great, which I hadn't thought about. And you said, well, it's like it's the next generation. You were photographing your sisters and including photographs of them, and now you're videotaping your son, filming your son and his friends and his photographs, and including his photographs. So that was very nice. That was very nice. I hadn't thought of it that way.
And with the mailer works, there's also something in that they, when we received the new ones at the gallery, they would come through, one at a time over a period of some months. But actually, it's only when you got here and we began installing them that it became really apparent just how kind of composed they are. And again, they're not just kind of individual photographs. I don't know, I haven't thought about this at all, but in the way that, you can bring letters together, and actually Mary Wollstonecraft did, and formed these kind of, or collected these various letters that were written over a period of time into a book, which then became, which had its own kind of autonomy. There's something about the way that those photographs arrive individually, but then you kind of compose them into these larger works, I guess. But I mean,
I've done it both ways. Sometimes I've just like mailed the photographs, and then on site I've made compositions. But actually, in this case, I made the compositions first and numbered them. And
did that start again as a kind of quite pragmatic thing? The first mailers, was that?
Yeah, because the very first time I did it was actually to Marie Guy Gallery in New York, and that's when I was living in Paris, and it was a really easy way to participate in a show overseas, to just make photographs, fold them up, and mail them, and I could just number them and tell the gallery that they go 1 through 4 and then down 4, and that's it. It's easy. They can just install the piece.
But
So
I think again,
it's very pragmatic.
that, when I look at those now as objects and as kind of works, the kind of play between these kind of surfaces as well.
That I didn't know.
The original photograph, then you have the tape,
right.
which forms a very flat surface. The address, which always refers, like any letter or any postcard, it's always referring to an absent place or an absent person. And then even the stamps, there's a kind of, they become almost like screens again. And there's something that feels like some of the same kind of qualities of the film works, actually. They're able to, those mailers kind of...
There's a lot of layering.
There's a lot of layering and a lot of kind of time and space collapsed into those surfaces somehow.
Yeah. And the thing with the tape is that, it ends up forming, these patterns on the surface of the photograph. And that I don't know. Like that's always kind of a nice surprise for me when I get here, and because when I lay them out, they're just photographs with nothing on them, and then I see the tape, and that's I haven't planned or predicted.
We've talked for about 50 minutes, so it's probably a good time to ask if there's any questions that any of you have for Moyra, or comments. No? Oh.
Yes.
Can you just, sorry, will you just wait? They're just going to give you a microphone really quickly. It's just for the recording.
Yeah, I was just, thanks, it's been very nice listening to this conversation.
Thank you.
I was just wondering if you could just tell a little bit about also the books that you've been making.
Yeah. So let's see. Yeah, I really love, as do many artists, I really love to make books. And I've made maybe like half a dozen at this point. And let's see, we're gonna make a book actually, based on the two works on Hemlock Forest and Les Godesses, and it'll be the two texts, and then this text that Avik Sen wrote. He basically watched everything and read everything and wrote a really wonderful text. And that will come out in the winter, I guess. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, no, that should be out early next year.
Yeah.
So, yeah, we'll have it in the bookshop, of course.
Yeah.
But you do, like some of the texts that as you say, are the starting point and end up, but like leading to the films in some way. You do publish them as essays as well, and you've done kind of collections of
the narration for Les Godesses was actually published as a little kind of chapbook pamphlet by this Paraguay press in Paris, and it had the original title was The Wet and the Dry. Actually, that was the title of that film for a long time, and it was only after I had done all the post-production that I changed the title. And let's see, was some of the texts were published after the films were made, and like the one for 50 minutes was published. And I mean, eventually I'll probably do a little book that'll have all the film texts in it. But
you were asked to contribute essays and to write for publications.
Yeah, I've been doing that. I've been writing and for different journals, and not a lot, but kind of, and that that's something that, I mean, it's very time consuming, but I get a lot out of that, and I also really like working with pictures and text in a book form, and working with a designer is so much fun, and working with editors, it's the whole process is really really gratifying. It's a very collaborative process, and everybody just kind of works together to make it as good as it can be, and it's
We're
obsessive. It's really obsessive. Oh my God! Because you have to read your text over and over and over again to find all the mistakes. By the time you're finished, you're like so sick of it. You never want to see it.
We're excited. This is the next piece of work, which is very nice and which will come off of the show.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments? No? Well, I'll just say one last thing, which actually leads on very nicely from your comment, actually, and that's that we've, on the occasion of Moyra's show, we've invited a group called Novel, two curators and academic and a curator from London. And they're going to be doing one of the upstairs residencies up here. And I'm just going to check the dates. They're going to be here between November the 22nd and December the 11th. And during that period, they'll be launching a new journal. I think the 3rd or 4th edition of Novel. A novel is it's a project which tries to bring together artists' writing that somehow slips between modes of either fiction or biography or poetry. They have this very nice quote, I won't read it all, but they talk about, novel asks us to think of writing as something distinct from information, as at least one realm of cultural production that is exempt from encompassing an obligation to communicate. So it's this notion of how writing can somehow slip out of these normal kind of modes and of both production and also delivery. So Novel are going to be here over that period. There's going to be readings, screenings, events. There'll be this new journal. So do look out for that and try and come and see those. And on December the 10th, with Novel, Bergen Kunsthal are organising a seminar called On Reading, which looks at, again, using the excuse of Moyra's work and this kind of notion of reading as an incredibly central kind of practice, actually, and a very sort of productive and active thing. We're going to be bringing together a number, again, of artists, academics, writers, for a one-day seminar which will explore many different aspects of reading as it relates to artistic practice. And at the moment, we're hoping that Moyra's going to join us from her apartment in New York by Skype, as well as Avik Sen, who will be in Calcutta. So we're going to try and do this kind of remote Skype event. But we've also got some great people, Hannah Gregory, Travis Yepperson, Caroline Munier, Studio for Propositional Cinema, and some other people that we're going to confirm over the next few weeks. So that's December the 10th. But I hope many of you will be able to come back for that. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you for listening. And finally, thank you, Moyra, for the exhibition and for this very illuminating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to work here. It's really just been an enormous pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.